And you can go ahead. We're good now.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here today. Thank you very much. And I'm very honored to be asked to offer a traditional acknowledgement for the Indigenous people of Canada. I know we're on this meeting across the country, and it's important to take a minute to acknowledge whose territory you're in and recognize the long-standing relationship that all of these peoples have had with the territory that you're on, that they were tasked with responsibility for keeping these places sacred, out of respect and responsibility for the next generation. So miigwech everyone for tuning in today, and I'm going to turn it over to David Merner. Thank you, David. David, I think you're on mute.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. I appreciate that. I appreciate both the introduction and getting me off mute. Thank you very much. For everybody who's online, I'm David Merner. I'm running for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. And I'd also just like to take a minute to introduce Lorraine. Lorraine's been the Indigenous Affairs Critic for the Green Party for many years. She's run for us as a candidate 5 times, and she's a small business owner in Kentville. And I really appreciate you being here, Lorraine, as a member of the River First Nation. I really appreciate that. And also as a member of our new Indigenous Advisory Circle. The idea behind the circle for everybody who's on the call is that the Green Party really wants to reach out to Indigenous communities and listen in a serious, thoughtful way. Look at how we are organized as a Green Party, look at our policy through an Indigenous lens, and take a systematic approach to engaging with and including Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast. J'aimerais dire merci à Lorraine et aussi à tous les autres gens qui se sont joints à nous pour lancer notre cercle, c'est-à-dire Desmond Bull, qui vient de l'Alberta, Bruce Weaver, qui vient de l'Ontario, à Guelph, et Brandy Farr aussi, qui est aussi de l'Ontario. It's a really wonderful group that we've gathered so far. And the idea is to start off with a Leaders Advisory Circle, Indigenous Advisory Circle, and then expand and grow. And so these first 4 founding members of the circle will start things off, and we'll follow them. Lorraine and the team will basically tell us how they want things to unfold. We'll listen very carefully and support them in creating this better approach to engaging Indigenous people in a deep way in the work of the Green Party of Canada. So that's a very short summary of where we're at. If you go to our davidmerner.com and click on our events page, you'll see for today's event that we have a paper which we've put out, and it's called Creating a Green Party Indigenous Advisor Circle. The paper is there in English and in French, depending on whether you go on événements under davidmerner.com on the French side, or events under the English side in davidmerner.com. And what we lay out in the paper very briefly is the history, the difficult history of what we call stolen lives, stolen lands, and stolen liberty relating to Indigenous people in Canada. And that history is a history that's ongoing. We continue to have a problem with systemic racism in Canada, in our institutions, including in the police, as the commissioner of the RCMP herself recognized. And we need to end this systemic racism and really continue with the efforts that are being made on reconciliation. Reconciliation work has to happen with the Green Party as well. And this is one of the ways that the Green Party wants to accelerate that work, take it very seriously. I believe the Indigenous Advisor Circle is going to be a breakthrough for us. And no matter who wins the leadership, I really hope it'll continue. It certainly will continue if I win the leadership. So that's a brief summary of what's in the paper, the very highlights, a summary of who our core members are, and a summary of the plan going forward, which is really going to be a plan that's led by the core members of our Indigenous Advisor Circle. Lorraine, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add before we turn it over to questions, if people have questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do think, I mean, as we talk about sustainable development and we talk about social justice and climate justice, we recognize as a party that we can't go anywhere without addressing long-standing relationship issues that Canada has had with Indigenous nations.
Mhm.
And the reason I agreed to support David's leadership is because I believe he completely understands the hard and heavy lifting that has to be done towards reconciliation. That reconciliation is not just a word, that it means work, and it means building relationships and reaching out to Indigenous nations and Indigenous representatives to offer advice and support on a way forward. That it's not an undertaking where the Green Party has all the answers. The Green Party is asking for support, for leadership, for innovation, advice, and guidance. And I think that's what makes this exciting. It makes it unique compared to, I think, some of the other parties. And I'm very hopeful that we can make progress together in partnership.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. And that's my hope too. I went into law a long time ago because I really believed that injustices had been done throughout our history, and that one of the ways to reconcile and address them is through the legal system, through litigation and legislation. But I learned as I went along that actually relationships that you mentioned are so key, building relationships, working together in a constructive sort of problem-solving way. So I really appreciate what you said. And adversarial litigation and even politics sometimes makes it hard to bring people together. And so I really appreciate that. We're getting questions now on Facebook that are coming in, and I'll read off first one that we've received, and we'll just do a question and answer. And the first question we've got is, how do people who want to be part of the Indigenous Advisory Circle connect? And we've talked about this briefly, and my sense is the best way is for people to contact members of our advisory circle. So as I mentioned before, Lorraine, Desmond Bull, also Bruce Weaver in Ontario, and Brandy Farr. So those are the three core members who are starting things out, and then our plan is to grow. And Lorraine, what do you suggest? Is it all right for people to send you an email, or what's the best way to connect with people on the
Yeah, I think it's best if you connect with me by email. So I think you have it. Maybe you could put it in the Facebook.
Yeah,
I'll
put it, yeah, we'll put it in there. And is it okay to use your Green Party one?
Yes.
That's great. I'll type it in, and we'll make sure everybody can see it on Facebook and on Zoom. All right. Next question. Are there any other questions on this? One of the things that I've spoken with Desmond Bull about, who's a counselor at the Louis Bull Band in Maskwacis territory, Treaty 8 territory in Alberta. And that's where I actually had my first job in law. I worked on Maskwacis territory. It was then known as Hobima. And it had a really tough background. It had the highest suicide rate in Canada at the time that I was working there as a young law student. And I worked with an amazing lawyer named Willie Littlechild. He was doing a lot of United Nations work, submitting legal documents to the United Nations Human Rights Committee in Geneva and fighting for Indigenous rights that way. And he went on to be a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner, one of the 3 Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners, and a wonderful man. And Desmond is in Alberta. He's an Alberta Green. And one of the things that he and Willie Littlechild have said to me is that we have to remember the traditional stewardship role of Indigenous people in terms of the land, the water, and wildlife habitat, because so much depended on the health of others and the relationship between humans and others. And I think that's one of the things that Desmond, who couldn't be here today, will bring to the advisor circle, is a real consciousness of the sort of connection to land and the importance of those relationships. So I'm just waiting to see if we have other questions coming in. I have another question here too, and it's about how will the circle be working? What is the plan for the circle? Is a short summary of this question, and my sense is, and Lorraine, this is still being worked out, is that we'll have an inaugural meeting, ideally in the next week or so, and the idea will be to start opening up the circle, inviting in people who could contribute, who are interested in contributing. Lorraine, I'm not sure how far you've thought down the road on this, but my sense is that especially recruitment now is important, bringing together a good group of people, and then having a conversation as a group as to what are the priorities. If it was me on the circle, and I'll be attending the meetings and listening very carefully, but one of the things I'm really interested in is how we prepare for the next federal election. Rumors of a fall election, I don't think it'll happen. But even if there's a spring election, it's not too early to start thinking about, what will our Indigenous platform be in the next election, and how can we improve on our platform from last time? And I think that might be one of the agenda items. I don't know if you agree, Lorraine, or if there's other issues like that.
Oh, I do. Yes, David, thank you. I think there are a number of things. Actually, there is a lot of work for the advisory circle to do. First of all, I think it is setting terms of reference for what the circle can contribute and the way in which the circle will work together. That's the first order of business, I think, is meeting each other and developing our own relationships with each other as Indigenous members of an advisory circle. And then looking at where we can input into, different parts of the party, different structures within the party. Where can we input into the policy process? And how do we advise the leader? And how do we inform the platform? Mm-hmm. So I think there's good foundational work within the party policy. Some really important statements have been made by the party, and one is to abolish the Indian Act, and looking at living free from the Indian Act. What does that mean? So as Indigenous members of an advisory circle, I think we really have to spend some time to get to know each other and find out what each of us is bringing to the circle, what our expectations are of each other, and what we want to put forward. Because we're going to be representing many different nations. It's not a homogenous group. It is First Nations, Inuit, Métis. The circle is open to all Indigenous peoples. And so, I think that's the first order of business, is setting our own goalposts, getting to know each other, and deciding how we're going to work together.
I love that. And the first time we met was at the convention in Vancouver, a Green Party biannual convention, and you were chairing that convention, I remember. And we did have a debate on the floor of the convention on abolishing the Indian Act and how we would go about doing it. It was a great debate. And one of the issues that came up in that debate was the idea that we should be following a nothing about us, without us rule when we're working with Indigenous people, and that it's really essential for us to listen first and work very closely with Indigenous people, especially on sensitive issues like how do we abolish the Indian Act? There are so many provisions in there, like the protections of reserve lands, for example, which are popular with Indigenous leadership. And yet we know the Indian Act is a colonial document that entrenches.
Yes, the commitment I mean, the commitment is to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And we have committed as a party to free, prior, and informed consent. So you're right, nothing about us without us. And FPEC is foundational to everything. It is an underpinning to everything that the party is going to do.
Yeah.
And should do. And I think recognizing, and also recognizing the distinctiveness of every individual nation, its own history, its own relationship with the land. It makes it so complex when we look at reconciliation across all these groups. Again, I just want to make sure everybody's clear that FPIC underpins everything.
That's really, really good. I have another question that's come in, and I'm sorry, I'm multitasking here, listening to you and looking at the questions that are coming in. But I totally agree that free, prior, informed consent is essential. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was in our platform last time. Implementing that with legislation is key. So I think we have a good base to work from, but I'm sure we're going to get a lot more insight with the circle. Another question that's come up is more about current events, and it's a question about what's happening on the East Coast in Nova Scotia with the Mi'kmaq and the lobster traps, and there's tensions there between Indigenous fishers and commercial fishers who have licenses from the governments of Nova Scotia and the federal government too, I believe. And so I'll take a shot at that if you want. It's a very tough one. Saying we have treaty rights that were recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada in the Marshall decision, and we're just exercising our Aboriginal rights to fish. And they're saying they have a very small number of traps out, and that they have a very serious approach to conservation, which is in their Indigenous government's laws and bylaws. And so they feel that it's appropriate for them to start a fishery. But it's also from the commercial fishers who have their licenses from the federal and provincial governments, it's seen as a very, very sensitive issue. There are boats on the water pulling out Indigenous lobster traps, I believe. And so this is one of those things which is very sensitive. I have been in the middle of a leadership race and not following the close details of this stressful event in Nova Scotia, but tensions are clearly high, just judging by the news reports. And it's one of those examples of where we need to resolve the fundamental issues. We need to figure out, how do we work with Indigenous communities? How do the fisher people in all communities work together? And if we don't take action to resolve longstanding injustices, if we don't take action on Supreme Court of Canada decisions, then what happens is these kinds of situations where there's very high stress levels, people get very angry and emotional, and it's totally understandable that that would happen. It's not understandable, though, that governments allow these kinds of problems to remain unresolved, literally for decades and decades and decades. I don't know if you're following this one, Lorraine, very closely, but that's my take on the situation in Nova Scotia right now.
Yes, well, I think it is. I mean, it's systemic. That's, what we have to admit. And throughout history, we know that resources have been permitted away to non-Indigenous interests. It wasn't until the 1960s that Indians were allowed off their First Nation reserves. So by design, we were excluded from economic opportunities. By design, permits and tenure were issued to corporate interests, non-Indigenous interests, and basically we were excluded from opportunities, and courts traditionally limited our access and limited our ability to make a living. So I think we have to address, I mean, if we want a country that we can be proud of, we have to address these injustices, and we have to ensure people have the means to build economy. And having the means to build economy means having access to resources.
Yeah.
It's very fundamental.
That's can't agree more with that. And as you're speaking, other questions are coming in, and the next one relates to Chief Dan George's book about the environment, and the book's title is My Heart Soars. And the question is, we didn't seem to listen to Chief Dan George, and what I'd like to know is, how will sustainable energy projects be managed by Indigenous peoples themselves? And I have a short story on that if you want me to get going, or would you rather go first?
No, go ahead, David.
So I live here in the Esquimalt Saanich on the south end of Vancouver Island, and it's beautiful here. We get lots of sun, but we also get lots of rain. And the Sauk First Nation decided it was going to move entirely off diesel-powered generators. And they've done that. They are entirely powered now by solar power. They have set up basically a small solar farm that not only powers the reserve, but it also puts energy back into the grid, into the BC hydro grid. So they're actually making money off their solar power project. Not only that, but the people who built it were Indigenous people from the reserve. And so now they have skills that are very marketable. They're working with other reserves around Canada on helping them to get off diesel generators. And it's one of those things that has sort of a win-win-win. They're powering their own reserve. They're making money off putting power back into the grid. And people on the reserve have been trained and are now spread Canada. And I just love telling that story because it really answers that question on how do you make sure that Indigenous people are benefiting from this and running these projects. And I think that's a key question. It's not just about doing right by the environment. It's also about jobs and opportunity for Indigenous people.
And I think it's also about respecting the autonomy of people to make their own decisions and undertake their own initiative, you know, having that respect.
Yeah, exactly. And I happen to know one of the people who worked on the reserve with a very, very progressive chief there, Gordon Planis. And I think it was an experience of deep respect with the community. And it helped to pull people together. And I know on that reserve, until COVID struck, we were going once a month. They have a really good reconciliation process as well with the local community, a whole bunch of people deeply involved in trying to build relationships and build reconciliation. And I think these things all go together: respect, reconciliation, respect for each other, respect for the environment. It all should fit together. And it seems to be happening now in Sauk, British Columbia, which I'm really proud of.
I think the other thing that's really important, David, is that political leaders send a strong signal to Canadians, not just to Indigenous communities for political points, but to send a strong signal, strong message to Canadians that it is time that we move on. It's time that we work together, reconcile relationships, improve the lot of all Canadians, and address, I think, address longstanding grievances. It's, I think it's, a time when Canadians and when Indigenous people are tired of political pandering, and it's a time for action to demonstrate leadership. Just, when there is systemic racism and violence against Indigenous people, it has to be addressed head on by political leaders. They have to send a signal to Canadians and a message, a strong message to say, this is not acceptable anymore. The state of Canada is suffering. The state of Canada is suffering from its inability and unwillingness to address injustice. We can only go forward together. And I just think leaders need to be strong and to, tell Canadians, like, this is not going to be tolerated any longer.
It's one of the reasons that we saw demonstrations earlier this spring in February and March, and I participated in some of those demonstrations with supporters of the Wet'suwet'en who were fighting the natural gas pipeline through their territory. And it was really a question of leadership. It took a long time for the ministers in Ottawa to pay attention, for our Prime Minister to pay attention, to actually go to Wet'suwet'en territory and meet with the traditional chiefs. And so much of this is about leadership. It's about respect for First Nations leadership, both elected Indian Act leadership and hereditary leadership. But it's really also, and I think mainly, about leadership from folks in Ottawa who just have to pay more attention to solving these problems now. The treaty process in Canada, I know from speaking with negotiators, has been badly broken for many, many years. Progress has been almost, almost non-existent in so many different treaty tables. And I think that sense that there's a lack of focus, a lack of leadership, a lack of determination to solve issues that really matter, like the boil water advisories that we see now. In 2015, the Liberals campaigned on making that a promise, a commitment, a number one priority for them, and yet there are still dozens and dozens of boil water advisories across the country. And so I agree, it is a question of leadership, and some party can also do by having this circle, this advisor circle, listening carefully, and then taking strong action, standing up for Indigenous communities systematically every day, every month, every year. I really hope that's what this circle will help us to do. Just going to look again at the question, and if we don't have any, we'll just go to some quick closing remarks. There is one more here. Actually, it's a question, it's a comment that I just made, which is, why do we have so many boil water advisories? Why don't we have clear drinking water on so many reserves? And the question also relates to the Bruce Power and the nuclear facility there, and its decommissioning over time, and what should be happening with those lands where Bruce Power is located. And then the final part of the question is, what is the pathway forward in cases of deep disengagement, such as the division between hereditary leadership in Wet'suwet'en territory and others in that community? So it's kind of three separate questions.
Okay. I want to take a crack at it. I think that's a long question. And for people who don't know me, my background really was journalism. I was a journalist in Elliott Lake during the decommissioning of the uranium mines in the early 1990s. And there was a federal government task force looking at citing low-level radioactive waste from Port Hope. And that was one of the first questions around nuclear waste that we had to deal with back in the 90s. And it's, of course, it's an emerging issue, or it's an issue that we've had to deal with for decades, and we still don't have an answer because there hasn't been adequate consultation. The other thing I'd like to contribute is to the fact that research is grossly underfunded, whether it's treaty negotiation tables or any consultation process that First Nations have to engage in. There's always a shortcoming when it comes to research money, and having the information, having the resources to participate in a free, prior, and informed consent process means having the resources to get the knowledge that we need. So decommissioning, Bruce, we're looking at contaminated lands. And I think that's what we have to look at. We have to say this is a contaminated site. With the pathways. So what was the third part of the question?
It's the pathways to solutions when especially there are divisions, say, between the traditional hereditary chiefs and
Yes.
yeah.
So research, yeah, again, you know, one of the motions that we put forward at convention was to work with communities, to work with Indigenous peoples, that we know we have unorganized groups, non-status, unrecognized, sovereign Indigenous nations that Canada has no mechanism to talk with. And if we can research, our history is layers and layers of Canadian historical lies about who we are. You know, even if we look at unceded Algonquin territory, we recognize the government of Ontario was trying to sign a land claim with an Indian Act band, and Algonquin people emerged saying we are not being recognized. So reconstitution of nations through sound research and evidence and information, we have to rebuild our communities as Indigenous people. We have to rediscover who we are, how we organize. We have to count all of our citizens. And we know we're at a place where many Indigenous women are not being recognized by the Indian Act. Their children are not being recognized by the Indian Act. It's a dangerous path to take to start looking at resolution of these long-standing conflicts when all of our people are not being counted, when all of our people are not at the table. So there are shortcomings right now through, you know, federal governments, whether they be liberal or conservative governments, shortcomings in the investment in research, historical research, that is absolutely necessary for us to define ourselves. So that's part of self-determination. So I think that's critical. That's a critical commitment that the Green Party has made in policy motions. Of course, it's a beginning.
It's a beginning, yeah. As a young articling student in British Columbia, I went to the courthouse where they were hearing the trial for the Wet'suwet'en case. That was in the summer of 1990. And as you say, research was so critical. They needed to track what was the history around those traditional territories and how were the different clans and leadership groups set up on those territories. And it was a massive undertaking. And that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the decision in the case occurred, I think, about 20 years ago. And yet, in this latest dispute for earlier this year, what happened is the provincial governments and the federal governments were claiming that they had negotiated already with the Indian Act chiefs, and they didn't need to speak to the hereditary chiefs, which was completely counter to the clear decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in the Gitxagan-Wet'suwet'en decision. And so these sort of historical problems you allude to, Lorraine, are actually continue to this day, right? And we see governments systematically ignoring Supreme Court decisions, clear-cut decisions on the fact that hereditary chiefs hold Aboriginal title in this territory, this very territory where the dispute was taking place. Indian Act chiefs are responsible for reserve lands. They're not responsible for the traditional lands covered by Aboriginal title. And so you just have to wonder, you know, you see these conflicts coming, and it's the same thing in Nova Scotia today. These are long-standing grievances where the Supreme Court of Canada has made very clear decisions, and yet the conflicts continue. They remain unresolved. Sorry, I'm on a bit of a rant, but that one feels personal to me. And it certainly felt very important this spring. I used to work at the Ministry of Attorney General here in Victoria, and the Wet'suwet'en protesters decided to shut down government. So I got to go back to my old offices downtown at the Ministry of Attorney General. I retired 2 years ago, and stand out there. And we figured that, you know, some of the more senior people would come in very early. So we got there very early at 6 a.m. And sure enough, our deputy minister walked in, and we were able to say, "Do the right thing by the Wet'suwet'en." He was very surprised. But we also had a question about the boil water advisories. And as I said earlier, I think this is about lack of focus and also lack of resources. It is expensive to address this, but it's a question of basically keeping your election promises. It's also about treating this in a systematic way. It's not just about putting in, a water purification plant here and there. It's about building capacity, it's about training, and it's also about authority so that Indigenous governments are able to properly take care of their own water quality and have the resources, the people and the training, the infrastructure all together. It can't just be, people from Indian Affairs flying in from time to time to check out how the system's working. It doesn't work that way. It has to be community-based. I see that as sort of an obvious thing to say. I don't know, Lorraine, if you know more than I do about this, but it does seem like one of these problems that just isn't getting solved.
Well, I mean, the challenges, of course, are resources, and you look at how communities, First Nations or Indian reserves are under-resourced. They are under-resourced when it comes to infrastructure and capital investment. And again, the nature of those arrangements are short-term contribution agreements that don't allow you to plan long-term. So they're not effective. I mean, it's certainly not cost-effective for anyone to have a short-term agreement. And basically administering crumbs in some cases. There has to be political will.
Yeah.
And I've watched, I mean, I've been around a long time, and I've watched various leaders make commitments because it was a good soundbite, because it was a good, headline for the day. But without, their words were empty because their actions were not there to back up what they had said in the past. And it is time that we turn a new leaf when it comes to politics, that leaders stand up and commit to doing the right thing, not just commit to doing the popular thing to get reelected, to pander to different parts of the electorate just for votes. We've got to move beyond that. We're in a new era. I mean, we are in a climate crisis, in a pandemic, and we are living in a country that is fraught with social justice, inequity, and systemic racism. And we need a strong, clear voice, the voice of spirit, to come out, tell the truth, and act justly. And I believe you're going to do that, David.
I really appreciate that. That choked me up, Lorraine. I think that actually is a really good place to leave it. Questions have been coming in. I think we've covered them all. And I'm really hoping that our circle, our Indigenous Advisors Circle, is able to really sustain what you just said, making sure that our leaders act as leaders, that we stand up. But before we stand up to make these changes, we really listen carefully and we really understand the issues, and that this circle becomes a way to ensure that happens.
Miigwech, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Lorraine. I really appreciate what you said today. Thanks.
Thank you.